Hi everyone, and welcome to the instructional video on how to add a new task to Open Problems. My name is Malte Luken. I am a team lead for integrative lung analysis at the Helmholtz Center Munich, and I'm a core team member of the Open Problems project.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniel Strobel. I'm a research assistant at Helmholtz Munich, and I'm the core contributor of the batch integration task in Open Problems.
We're going to try to guide you through the process of adding a new task to Open Problems and use the batch integration task as an example for how to do this. First of all, a task is a structure of three different parts. There are datasets, methods, and metrics. Datasets are typically the ground truth data that where you have knowledge of, which you can use to run methods and get an output of which can be evaluated. Methods use these datasets, as mentioned, to perform the task that you are defining. And the output from these methods is then fed to metrics to give a score between 0 and 1, which is an evaluation of how well the task was performed by the metric. Typically 0 denotes a bad score and 1 denotes a good score. The way we go through these three parts is using an n-data object. This is a Python-based single cell data structure and is the output of a data loader in the for the datasets, is taken as an input to any method, and then is further passed on to metrics to be turned into an output of a single number. This is true for both Python and R methods. We'll get a little bit more into how R methods can be added, or R metrics can be added to Open Problems in a second. What's really important when you define a new task is to define the API for your task. What that means is a template for how datasets, methods, and metrics should look like within the confines of your task. As an example, you can imagine a method API here, which is taken from the label projection task, where the input, the input that is required is information on which cell type labels, which batch, and whether a cell is in a train or test data set. The method can then take this information from the data loader and perform a label projection, and then output this into an labels pred field in the adata.obs column, which means that every single cell gets a predicted label. And so by defining this API, more people can introduce methods into your defined task, and they understand exactly what they can expect as input and what they should give as output with the exact labels. Methods and metrics may, of course, require particular environments. This is taken care of via Docker containers, so that you can run your personal method that you want to add, or any metric you found somewhere which might have particular requirements, and run it in a consistent manner in Open Problems. To get a little bit more into what a Docker container might look, or what Docker containers there are already, here's a look at what we have so far. There are 4 base Docker containers which are included in Open Problems, and more are being added continuously. The base image is the Open Problems image. It's a Python image which you can run, where you can run most simple Python methods and metrics. There's an R equivalent called Open Problems R base for R methods and metrics. If your method or metric that you would like to add has particular requirements, these requirements can just be added to the Open Problems Python extras or Open Problems R extras Docker containers. Of course, if there is a dependency clash for the method that you are trying to add, you can define your own Docker container and basically state for every method or metric that it should use this particular container that you've defined. This is possible through decorators, function decorators here. In this case, we show one example for a method. This is just a template method. There is an image keyword at the bottom here, a parameter, which tells you which Docker container this should be run in. If this is not stated, it will be run in the Open Problems default container. Now to get to how to add Python or R methods. Python methods can be added natively, as the whole project is coded in Python currently. R methods can be run in 2 different manners. R methods can either be run through the scprep module, which contains an R function with 3 separate parts: the setup, the arguments, and the body. The setup involves which libraries must be loaded. Arguments refer to which arguments are passed to the function, and body just contains the body of the R function as you would otherwise write it in an R file. We also have the option to just natively add a .r script, which contains an R function, and to have a Python declarator to basically tell Open Problems how to parse this R function into an SE prep layout. Finally, it's also important to include tests for your task. Tests are defined within the api.py file, and these include anything from checking that the dataset API is actually upheld so that the correct slots are being provided to a method, or that any method that you've added works as it should. And these will automatically be run in the background through a GitHub Actions pipeline. And now Daniel will take you through how this looks in practice using the batch integration task.
So as Malte has shown you, we have the base structure of datasets where we load the datasets. We have the methods folder and we have the metrics folder. We have the api.py file where we define the tests and the test datasets, and we have the init.py file where we load the methods. In the batch integration graph task, we have datasets that have two specific ops columns, the batch column and the label column, and we expect the count data to be in AData counts, and we do expect a log normalized matrix in ADataX. This data is then passed on to the methods, which compute a neighborhood graph and store it in connectivities and distances in OPS-P. And then this is passed on to the metrics functions, which work on that data and return a value from 0 to 1. Each function that we have has a declarator. So here for the dataset function that we have, we define the image that we want to use. So for the datasets, we use the Open Problems R-base image, as we use some R code later on in the processing in this function. And we basically move around columns to the places where we expect them to be for our later analysis, and do some pre-processing and then return that file so that the methods can work on that file. So here we have an example method from the task. There you also need to define a method declarator for each method that we have. You need to define some metadata for that method. And again, you need to define which image you want to use. In this case, we use a custom image as we have some dependency clashes with other functions. You can just use libraries that are already existing and import them in your method functions, and then just run them if they have the output that you want and return the data from the method that you imported. As Malte mentioned, you can also use R functions. So what we did here is we use the seprep run R function. We just import the R libraries that we need. We expect a single cell experiment as an input. So the ndata object is automatically converted to a single cell experiment file so that it can be used in R. And we expect some additional data. And then you can just use R code in the body of the function. And then the resulting single cell experiment data is again converted into an data object. So you can use that function then in your Python code and return the data as you need it. As I mentioned, we use a custom Docker container. All the Docker containers are defined in the Docker folder of the repository. And in each Docker container folder, you have your Docker file where you run Linux install functions and install packages with pip. Or you can also manually install packages by cloning them from Git and then moving the source of the package to the Python side packages folder in case they are not installable by pip. After the methods, the metrics functions compute the metrics on your methods. There you again have a declarator where you define your image that you want to use. And here we also just use imported libraries from other projects that we can just use. The last important part of your task definition is the API.py file, where you define, for example, a check data set, where you check if columns that you expect are present in the data set. You define functions to check if the results are present in your files returned from the method functions, and you create some sample data sets that are downsampled to only contain 200 observations for 300 cells, so something in that region, so you can test your task fast. So now that I've shown you how to add a new task, I just wanted to quickly mention some tips and tricks so you don't run into some easily avoidable issues. If you're adding additional Docker containers, be sure to install open problems in them, as that's needed for the pipeline. In the init.py file, where you import your methods and metrics functions, be sure to not import them all at once, but individually, as this might result in problems otherwise. In case you have very similar tasks that require similar input and output, like we, for example, had the batch integration task on graph data, on full feature data, and on embedding data. So we have 3 very similar tasks. We build subtasks inside a root task. So the whole repository is a lot cleaner, and we can reuse code. So to define a root task, you can start your task with an underscore and then have your subtasks within this root task. So you don't need to, so the root task isn't imported by itself, but only the subtasks within this root task. I hope that this was helpful for you, and then that you can work with that. And if you have any questions about any of the stuff we explained, please don't hesitate to contact us anytime for any questions. Yep. So thank you. And
yeah, good luck.